Why there are no porcupines or skunks on Cape Breton. During the war between the English and the French in Canada, the English soldiers at Louisbourg, Cape Breton, captured a French priest. They tortured him by putting him naked into a pen with porcupines and skunks, to kill him by their quills and the odor. Then he said that never again would skunks or porcupines live on the island, and now today there are none here. Even if they are brought to the island, they die when they eat the things that grow here, on account of the curse. Hello, my name is Ian, and today we're talking about F.G. Speck's Some Micmac Tales from Cape Breton Island. Of course, this was done in 1915, so he's using the old orthography for the Mi'kmaq, the M-I-C-M-A-C. We sometimes talk in this sort of apologetic hushed tones about things being the product of their times, and sometimes the terminology and the orthography just had yet to be developed. So we're going to, for that at least, we should perhaps cut Speck a little bit of slack. We don't have to cut him slack for everything, but maybe for still using that spelling. We're going to be encountering that a lot if you read about anything in Atlantic Canada. Up until the late 20th and early 21st centuries, you're still going to come across the old spelling. Frank Speck was an interesting guy. He was one of the sort of founders of contemporary anthropology. He wrote a number of articles about First Nations all across North America. He was fluent in Algonquian orthography and its conventions, if not necessarily in Mi'kmaq specifically. He did a lot of work in Conn River among the Mi'kmaq there, and he did some work with the Innu of southern Labrador, among many other places. This was work that he was doing as part of his more sort of anthropological interest in hunting patterns in among the Mi'kmaq and the Beothuk, and as much as we can, rediscover the hunting patterns of the Beothuk in Newfoundland. And he has sort of a major work that references this. And I think first we need to think about the way that anthropology and folklore have sort of been strange bedfellows. For the longest time, American Folklore Society literally was split between the MLA, the Modern Language Association, so folklore is a form of this, like a subdiscipline of literature, and the American Anthropological Association, so folklore as a subcategory of anthropology. And in some ways, anthropology departments still consider, or the anthropology discipline still considers folklore a kind of subdiscipline of it, which is sort of unfair, but it's also a conversation that's often not worth having because you end up having them with anthropologists. So his major concern was the symbolic interaction of how the system of hunting, and then how the entire political economy and social apparatus of the Mi'kmaq operated. And narrative was, for him, a bit of an insight into that. But in a way, the difference between how an anthropologist understands folklore and how a folklorist understands folklore is that the folklore for the anthropologist is really only interesting in service of how it is a kind of an explanatory model for the system itself. So it's kind of a source of data. I guess briefly, anthropologists aren't necessarily that interested in creativity. That's unfair. But anyway, Speck was a key figure in anthropology and subsequently in folklore study. And as much as his work can be potentially have an asterisk next to it in terms of that it doesn't necessarily meet 21st century standards, it is one of those steps along the way that got us to a better approach and a better understanding. And his project was always comparative. And I mean, he deliberately basically says as much. His opening paragraph of this, the following tales, well, he does a couple of good things. First is he doesn't disguise his sources. He's like, this is where I got it from. The following tales were written down from the dictation of Chief Joe Julian of the Sydney Band, which would basically be the member two band, and John Joe of Waikagama, Cape Breton Island. As a contribution to comparative mythology, they represent local versions of some myths well known not only among the Micmacs, but among the northern Algonquin in general. He begins with the idea that he is a comparativist, that he is interested, again, bringing his vast understanding of so many North American First Nations traditions to bear. He's interested in the specific examples in Cape Breton that will find analogs elsewhere, which again is a pattern of how anthropological and folkloristic studies was at the time, in that narratives are interesting in part because they exist in multiple versions. And we're still very keen on the idea of version and type. Type being sort of those things that the versions hold in common. I'll go back to my classic examples of like Cinderella. It's a young, maltreated stepsister, stepdaughter in a family. She displays piety and humility. The other members of the family display avarice and greed and vanity. There is an opportunity for a public event like a ball. She is not allowed to go until she's actually able to complete impossible tasks, but she's able to complete those impossible tasks because of magical helpers who are only there because it is fundamentally a benefit of piety and humility and obedience. And then she arrives at this event and is so disguised that she's not recognized by people who know her. Instantly is fallen in love with by the suitor. She leaves a token, almost exclusively. She leaves a token of a shoe. Returns home, returns to her humble ash-covered disguise, cinders, Aschenputtel, and she's able to be subsequently recognized by the token, by the shoe. And so that is basically what Cinderella is, and then we can identify the French, we can identify the German, we can identify the Chinese, and so on. So it is interesting that these things happen in multiple instances. And so again, as comparative mythology, comparative folklore at the very least, before we start talking about the various genres, that's his project. And so here are these local examples. Hey, reader, you probably are going to notice other examples. And that was his thing. That was the thing at the time. And that's not necessarily a bad stretch. But if you are only interested in the comparative, you start to erase the idea that the specific, the individual, has meanings for the community itself, independent of whether that narrative has its version parallels in other contexts. So, for example, I mean, he gives the Cape Breton Glooscap narrative, and he makes points here, and he makes points in his other works that this seems to have been transplanted as his work from Glooscap narratives in New Brunswick. But and you can say whatever you want about that, pro or con. Who knows necessarily specifically the history of the spread and transference of this narrative? But we do know that at this time, this narrative was considered important, and that is where we begin, not simply that this narrative is available elsewhere. And the Glooscap narrative is very fascinating because so much of it is about describing the landscape. Basically, it's this story of how the giant, that is Glooscap, does various things and leaves his mark literally and figuratively on the land. And you could do a tour of the island. You could point to the various places that he, in this narrative, has meant to have been, and that the fact that the landscape is like this proves the Glooscap narrative. That is sort of the inherent logic of ideological legends. And it's also really interesting in that particular narrative the modern aspects to it, the references to the white man, the references to the North Pole and Peary's visit of it. Peary in 1909 had just gotten to the North Pole, and Peary himself, Robert Peary, when Peary came back, the place where his ship landed was Sydney Harbor, which is literally 100 feet from where I'm sitting right now. And so Peary would have been a known historical figure. So when Joe Julian of the Sydney Band, whose community would have been 200, 300 meters just down that way, he would have known. So he's incorporating the modern into the narrative. That is, it's important that the narrative is made flush. So that's why it's a really interesting iteration of it. I love the idea that he predicts, Glooskap predicted Chief Membertou and his baptism in 1610, and that Glooskap had to leave in order to make way for Christ. So within the Mi'kmaq sacred narratives is also the introduction of Mi'kmaq Christianity and their sacred narratives. So it's this, in a way, it's this both and, that one gave way to the other. And the fact that there's that additional story where Glooskap and Christ meet and they are equivalent to each other. They have, and that equivalency is rendered as mutual respect. That's a fascinating way of thinking about how the contemporary to 1915, but contemporary to the 21st century as well, contemporary Mi'kmaq identity is equally and in a non-competitive way, both in terms of the pre-contact cosmology of Glooskap and the post-contact cosmology of Catholicism, and it works so very well. And even 100 years ago, these narratives were part of the tradition that easily wove them together, seamlessly wove them together. So it is interesting, and now maybe I'm being Papa Anthropologist here, but it is interesting to see how these narratives help to explain and substantiate and justify and undergird the social structure that they are living in the day. Folklorists have this issue of sometimes having just a bunch of stories, and Speck is a little bit better in terms of context. And one of the things that, but before I get too far, one of the things I really do like about Speck is that he is retelling these stories, and it would be lovely if we had the actual narratives themselves, if we had the recordings themselves. And that would be preferable. It's always preferable, because at the very least we're moving away from the editorial gloss. It's even better if we have the recordings and not even a incredibly faithful transcription of those recordings, because the recordings themselves can give us a certain amount, just additional information, and we can see them as expressive as opposed to words on a page. There's only so much transcription can allow for words on a page to really pop. But the point I was getting to was, so he rewrites them, and he doesn't try and imitate some kind of speech pattern. This is the story. He's in a way, he's refreshingly indifferent. It's like, no, I'm just going to tell you the facts of the story as they are progressed, and I'm going to tell you them in contemporary American English. It's like, okay, were it otherwise, that would be preferable if you could actually have the original text, but I'd rather you do that than I'd have you do mock First Nations English speaking. If you've read the reading by Edward Jack, that is done in this sort of pidgin that is unsettling at the very least. So this is, in a way, this is a better representation because it doesn't try to represent or to recreate. It reports more than anything else. Just like, well, I wish it were otherwise, but I am glad it isn't that. So then the next story and again, it's Tales from Guts, and this is the point that I wanted to make, in that there is something about the stories, all of the stories, and maybe it's just the way he presents them, maybe it is the way that he has retold them, but as I'm reading them, I am constantly seeing parallels in other traditions, and not First Nations traditions, or not only First Nations traditions, but Greek mythology, Roman mythology, and so on. So this is, and again, now I don't know whether it is simply his presentation and therefore my reading of it, or my reading of it in general, or what. I cannot determine that. But it's, as I go through it, I'm categorizing it in terms of patterns that I see, patterns that I have seen elsewhere. And then there's the temptation to immediately leap to one of two conclusions. You could leap to both, but one of two conclusions. One is that these are, I guess you could actually have three conclusions. One I'm going to dismiss. One is that there's this sort of Jungian shared deep cosmology, and all narratives or all mythologies and all mythological systems are going to necessarily have these core elements and motifs. I kind of think that's malarkey. Ethnogenesis, no, sorry, not ethnogenesis, polygenesis is quite possible. You don't have to necessarily talk about this sort of like world deep symbolic language in a Jungian perspective. The second is thinking of them not necessarily as all are going to come to this because it's the deep psychology, the human psychology necessarily speaks in these specific symbolic forms, but that it's all this matter of spread, that all these narratives have this sort of origin point, and so we are basically seeing a almost in that, and I hate this metaphor, that game of telephone, that we have seen there is some original version, that an original storehouse of narratives that all humanity once had, and then we just get these little tendrils that get on the surface level. They seem radically different, but they are fundamentally very much the same. And that's, I just think that bad historic geographic method, because again, I think polygenesis is possible. Then the third is, it's not the same as the shared narratives, and it's not the same as the Jungian archetype thing. Archetype, that's the word I was looking for earlier. The third is that there are these things that aren't built into our psychology. They aren't built on this level of like the subconscious, but they are sort of the way that the world operates, than the way that human beings tend to function and congregate. And particularly groups that have tend to function and congregate and are immersed in similar cultures, because as much as this is about First Nations cosmology, there's clearly 300 years of Catholicism and exposure to colonial narrative traditions as well, and how seamlessly this can be incorporated, which is different from this shared source. We're now talking about syncretic traditions, but how these sort of themes tend to resonate. And maybe there's whether through contact or whether through just this is the way that stories function, we see these I see these parallels to other traditions. So, for example, in the Taken from Guts, you have the idea of this sort of remarkable revenge story. You have the miraculous birth. You have a brother's motif, the younger brother who is ultimately the more powerful. Although the brothers aren't in conflict, it isn't a Cain and Abel. It isn't a Jacob and Esau. Jacob and Esau? Jacob and Esau. It isn't an Ishmael and Isaac. It isn't any of those sort of pairings. But it might be reminiscent of it. Who knows how this redolence works. You have matricide. You have, I mean, when I was reading this one, taken from Guts, I kept on thinking about Greek mythology particularly. And because taken from Guts and his brother are born of giants, but they are not meant to be giants themselves. And fundamentally, they take revenge on their parents' generation in a way that's very similar to how the gods took revenge on the Titans, and how, Zeus was eaten by his father, and all his siblings were eaten by his father, but Zeus replaced himself with a stone and then was able to slice everyone open again. All that kind of thing. This weird destruction of the former generation, the generation that birthed them, but birthed them in a decadent way, and that there's a sort of remarkable overthrow. So with the Taken from Guts narrative, I'm just going to sort of skip ahead a little bit because, again, talking story is only sort of so fruitful. But with the Taken from Guts narrative, the story of Badger, the rabbit and otter stories, it is so tempting to read them and enjoy them. And I think we should not necessarily dismiss the idea of the aesthetics of story. We should never dismiss the idea of the aesthetics of story, because stories are aesthetic and artistic acts. And we can almost, they're verbal, so there's a certain limit to what I'm saying, but we can almost enjoy them without understanding them, because we can see the artistry that's involved, even if we don't necessarily know the deeper meanings. And I think it is better when we know the deeper and deeper meanings. But the fact that we can enjoy them on as merely as artistic performances is an important inroad. And otherwise, we are not allowing ourselves one of the basic ideas of what it is to be homo narrans, a being that communicates through story. But what was the point that I was making? Yes, in all these stories, it is so, once you get past the level of enjoyment, there are all the questions that they raise for me on my sort of intellectual aspect about what does it mean? What shaped this particular form? Why was it told this way at this particular moment? And again, at this particular moment to Frank Speck. What was he doing that encouraged the chief in Wakagama, the chief in Sydney, to tell this story this way? And that's the issue of the performer not simply being a conduit, but someone who brings artistry to the communication of something, whether that something is felt like it is theirs or felt like it is the community's, what ownership, what proprietorship they have, they are making an artistic performance. I want to know those questions. Speck isn't there to answer them for me, so I can only have conjecture. But they do invite comparison, and I'm just so fascinated by them, because I can just see these things. Like the otter and rabbit is basically a wise and foolish, and then it ends. The otter and rabbit. I love how it ends, where Otter is chasing Rabbit because Rabbit stole Otter's eels, and Rabbit keeps disguising himself as a human, sitting on a porch. And then finally, Otter, as Rabbit, has disguised himself as a galleon off the coast. Otter figures it out, and I'll just read the little bit of. When Otter came out to the shore, he saw the big ship anchored there, and the big gentleman in a white suit walking on deck. Otter cried, "You can't trick me now. You're the man." Then Otter swam out toward the ship to board it and kill Rabbit. But the big gentleman said to his sailors, "Shoot him. He's worth a lot of money over in France." And it ends. And I don't understand that, but I understand something about the nature of story, and I think that's a punchline. Doesn't that sound like a punchline to you? And I'm wondering, I'm wondering what the hell that means. And I think there must have been a lot of rib tickling there. Like, France? Otter? What's going on? You got to tell me. So these are invitations to stories, but more than anything, what they are is, Speck was making a contribution, as far as he was concerned, to providing some additional raw data to the overarching folkloristic project of comparative narrative. Cool. That's all very well and good. He provides a little bit more context by at least forefronting who the tellers were, although he doesn't differentiate between who tells what story. He was talking to the chiefs in his larger project of trying to establish ancestral and hereditary hunting grounds on the island. So he'd be talking to people who wield that kind of authority. He isn't talking to everyone in the community. And so, the people who he's talking to have a certain amount of privilege. They have respect, they have esteem, they have a position of elder, but they also have within that community privilege. And so it would be interesting to have collected from other people, but he wasn't interested in that because he collected from the people who he was interested in collecting the data of governance from. Anyway, beginning to digress. So he made this contribution, and it's not a contribution that we should dismiss merely because there isn't sufficient context, or because he was less interested in what the narrative meant for the local and was much more about look at how it's connected to other narratives. But we can still be critical. We can still read this cautiously. But it is one of those early moments when Atlantic Canada as a field site was explored from people who were calling themselves, or conversely were going to be communicating to journals that framed themselves as folklore, and for folklorists. So it's a good reading. It's a hard reading. It is what it is. It's still, even though it's a sympathetic, an empathetic, and a engaged interlocutor between a First Nations community and the Academy, it is still an outsider who gets to represent and who gets to have the last say and who gets to have the interpretation and who gets to determine what is relevant and what is not relevant. And so it's part of our icky heritage. Yeah. Rough reading. Good reading, rough reading. It can be both. Anyway, my friends, I don't have anything else to say. So this is Ian. I've been talking about some Micmac Tales from Cape Breton Island by Frank Speck from 1915. And as ever, I wish you absolutely nothing but the best. Be well.